What's up, savvy expats? In this video, we're covering 10 daily issues that expats face in the Philippines. Alright, without wasting time, let's get into it. So kicking off this list, the first daily issue that expats face in the Philippines is the terrible government bureaucracy. Of course, the government bureaucracy is not going to give you a painstaking headache every day in the Philippines, but when you have to deal with it, which all of you will, it can be frustrating. It seems as if that they just don't care about wasting your time. When it comes to filing the most simplistic paperwork or just getting a response back, it can take forever. Things that take 5 to 10 minutes in the US can drag on for over an hour here. So when you go to the US Embassy or immigration, it's not uncommon to see people waiting in line for hours. That is why it is best to handle your paperwork online if you can. Now for the second issue that expats face in the Philippines, that is stomach aches. This is more of an issue that occurs upon arrival in the Philippines rather than every single day. So once you get used to the food in the Philippines, you should be fine. It's funny because whenever an expat tells me that they had a stomach ache their first few days in the Philippines, I tell them that it's their initiation process of getting settled down in the Philippines. Reason being is because it's not uncommon to see many expats get stomach aches when getting used to the food here. This is something that I dealt with and most people I know have dealt with, but only on a mild level. It could be due to the street food, perhaps you ate something spoiled, or plain and simple, your stomach just isn't used to the food. I find it funny because coming from a Western country, we're used to eating foods that are sprayed with pesticides and injected with hormones. But when you come to the Philippines where the food is generally natural, your stomach has to get used to that. When my uncle first visited the Philippines, one mistake he made was putting ice in his scotch. Of course, not all water is bad in the Philippines, but I guess in certain places they use tap water. So he ended up getting a stomach ache, and this is something that you may need to be wary of also. But if you're planning on moving to the Philippines permanently, stomach aches is just something that you may need to let take its course. Some expats don't get stomach aches, while others do. It depends on the person, but this is just a heads up of what to potentially look out for. Moving on to issue number 3 expats face daily in the Philippines, that is the unavailability of certain foods and products. So this issue strongly depends on where you live. If you live in a secluded province or a small town, this is an issue that you'll likely encounter. If, on the other hand, you live in a major city like Manila or Cebu City, Western foods and products are available to you. But for many expats living in the Philippines, one problem they commonly face is not having foods they're used to from their home country. For us, if there's anything that we didn't like or couldn't find, we just make it at home. For example, if you're from places like New York, Chicago, Italy, then you may find that the pizza here is not exactly the same. So one thing that I picked up was making pizza from scratch, from the dough to the sauce, everything. And this is something that you'll likely have to improvise on other things. Although you'll live without having certain items and foods that you're used to from your home country, you eventually get used to it. This is not a total deal breaker for expats moving to the Philippines, but this is definitely something to consider. Another thing that isn't common in the Philippines is dishwashers. Most people hand wash their dishes here as opposed to you where you may be used to just throwing your dishes in the dishwasher. Unless you had your own house built or you live in an upper class home or condo, you're not going to find dishwashers here. Yet another thing that isn't common here in appliances is dryers. Here in the Philippines, it's most common that people air dry their clothes. And one of the biggest issues for expats is the lack of options and quality for phones, laptops, and computers. When it comes to buying tech in the Philippines, the local brand quality is not the best. And when you do find a place that is up to par, for example Apple or Samsung, it's much more expensive here. One of the most common forms to counter this is by buying all of your tech items before you move to the Philippines. Otherwise, you are going to pay some hefty prices. So these are just a few of the unavailable items in the Philippines. Moving on to issue number 4 that expats face daily in the Philippines, that is the higher likelihood of getting scammed. Now this doesn't necessarily pertain to big scams where you get robbed on hundreds of dollars, but it is just smaller scams like getting overcharged at the markets or paying for things that you don't have to. Thankfully, this doesn't happen every day for expats, but there is a higher likelihood of this. As you know, if you're a foreigner or you're someone that just speaks English, you're seen as someone with lots of money here. Most Filipinos think that if you're from another country, that automatically makes you rich. So it's not uncommon that foreigners get charged more than than the locals do, and they have to pay for things that normally are free. Your lack of knowledge of life here in the Philippines can easily be used against you. And I'm sure you've already heard about the taxi cab scams in the Philippines. Sometimes taxi drivers will take you in loops, they'll take the long route, or sometimes won't even use the meter at all to squeeze the most out of you. But really, the hard part is more about the fact that you're getting used more than it is about the financial burden. For most of you, getting scammed out of $1 isn't gonna break the bank. And chances are, they need that dollar a lot more than you do. But as time goes on, and you not only learn about the prices in the Philippines, but also the overall way of life, you're gonna know your way around. When people try to scam you or make you go through processes that the locals don't have to, you're gonna be able to easily detect that. Now, for the 5th daily issue that expats face in the Philippines, that is the sounds, pollution, and congestion. Yet again, this strongly depends on where you live, but you will inevitably experience this in the Philippines. Let's start with the sounds. As I've mentioned in the past, the sounds of roosters crowing, dogs barking, karaoke in the middle of the night, and loud vehicles is something that you will have to get used to in the Philippines. Unless you're willing to live in a province very far from the noise, then you're going to experience this. But even if you do live in the province, then you're still going to hear the crowing roosters and the barking dogs. And that's one of the reasons why I'm so biased about living in BGC for many expats, because though it's pricier, you don't have to deal with many of these things. Actually, you don't have to deal with any of these things. And all the while, you're still living in the Philippines. It's very westernized, it's urbanized, it's clean, there's no pollution, and you're still just right near the province. So if you're curious about living this sort of lifestyle in the Philippines, feel free to download the free guide I made for moving to BGC Philippines just for you. It's completely free and it's down below. As for pollution, this also depends on where you live. When it comes to living in certain areas of Manila, the smog and pollution is terrible. And even Cebu City is getting to this point. And the same goes with congestion. Traffic and crowded housing is the norm in the Philippines. You'll find that housing butts up right next to each other, and traffic is something that takes ages to get through. So this is yet another issue that not only expats face in the Philippines, but also the locals. Moving on to the 6th issue that expats face in the Philippines, that is inadequate healthcare. The healthcare in the Philippines, unless at the private hospitals in the major cities of the Philippines, is not good. Simply put, healthcare can be excellent or poor depending on your income level and where you live. In Philippine healthcare, there's a private sector and a public sector. The private sector is found in cities like Manila, where the facilities are westernized and the healthcare is up to international standard. The public sector is found in the provinces more catered to the lower economic class. These places offer basic health services but are most often understaffed and under-equipped. Moving on to issue number 7 that expats and locals face in the Philippines, that is trash and poverty. Something that you will inevitably have to get used to in the Philippines is seeing trash and poverty. In the US, throwing your trash out in public spaces is both illegal and frowned upon. But here in the Philippines, one of the first things that I saw here at my first month in the Philippines was seeing a 5-year-old kid throwing his trash out into a river. It was just so casually done, and it was also a culture shock for me. So it's very common for the people to throw out their trash wherever they go, and not in the trash cans either. And when it comes to poverty, this is a sight that's everywhere in the Philippines. At the end of the day, the Philippines is still a third world country, so expect to see poverty. This is just the reality, but eventually you do get used to it. Now for the 8th issue that expats face in the Philippines, that is the lack of infrastructure. Again, don't expect the Philippines to be just like your home country, because one of the first things that you'll notice in the Philippines is the lack of infrastructure. You'll find that the transportation system is poorly planned and the roads are situated in the most inconvenient way possible. You'll also find that because of the lack of infrastructure, everything is compact and crowded. This is what causes the congestion in the Philippines. On the bright side, the Philippines is a rapidly developing country, so I feel like this is something that we won't have to worry about as much in the future. Now for the 9th issue that expats face daily in the Philippines, that is the heat and humidity. If you're from a cold place like Chicago, 60-degree weather is shorts and t-shirt weather. So when you come to the Philippines and it's 90 degrees outside almost every day, it can be unbearable at times. But then again, it's also nice because you don't have to deal with the cold, dark, and damp weather. Here in the Philippines, on the other hand, though it's hot and humid, it's also sunny and tropical. So needless to say, an AC unit is a must when living in this country. The heat and humidity is something that some expats get used to, while others never do. Moving on to issue number 10 for expats and locals living in the Philippines, that is bugs in the house. I can't speak for every household in the Philippines, but bugs seem to always crawl their way into the houses here. Whether it be cockroaches, ants, mosquitoes, or spiders, these are all creatures that just seem to find their way in no matter what. It's almost like living in the jungles of South America. But in reality, I wouldn't say it's that bad. It's not like you're gonna find them in your bed all the time and it's everywhere you go. It's just something that you'll come across here and there. Even for our provincial house in the Philippines, if no one occupies a place for months on end, ants are always there. This is yet another issue that expats and locals face daily in the Philippines. Now for a bonus issue that we all know about in the Philippines, that is the traffic and terrible driving. It's no secret that the traffic is horrendous in the Philippines. Driving here is like every man for themselves, so expect to get cut off, see U-turns, witness accidents, and hear lots of honking. This is just one of the downsides that comes with the package deal of all of the upsides of living in the Philippines. So there you have it, CEBU expats. Those are the 10 issues that expats face daily in the Philippines. These are issues that are culture shocks at first, but are eventually overcome by expats in the Philippines. If you enjoyed this video and found it to be of value, be sure to like and subscribe. And so thank you for watching CEBU expats, and I'll see you in the next video. God bless.